Welcome to part 4 of my Blender for Beginners tutorial series. If you haven't seen the previous parts, then definitely check out the tutorial playlist with the link in the description. So in the previous part, we started modeling the snowman, and in this part we're going to continue modeling by modeling more parts of the snowman, like the carrot nose and the hat and some other parts of the snowman. And if you'd like to help support the channel and purchase the finished tutorial project files, you can get that on my Gumroad store and Patreon page. And if you're enjoying this tutorial series and you'd like to help support the channel here on YouTube, then some great ways to do that are by checking out the YouTube memberships by clicking down there on that join button, and you can also use the super thanks feature here on YouTube to send me a little tip if you're enjoying this tutorial series. And then just one more thing before we start, I wanted to let you know about an amazing Blender add-on for creating realistic landscapes. With the Terrain Scapes add-on, you can create your own custom landscapes. Start by adding a terrain, and then you can load different mountain presets. You can also combine different layers of mountains on your terrain. The detail levels of the mesh is also customizable. The add-on also comes with material presets to add materials to your landscapes, like rock and snow to the mountains and grass to the ground. The add-on also comes with many different biomes to add to your landscapes, like a mixed forest, jungle, rocky forest, bushes, and other biomes. You can also add different object layers, like rocks, grass, plants, and trees. You can find my full add-on review video with the link in the description, and if you purchase the add-on through my affiliate link, you'll be helping to support this channel. Alright, so before we go any further with the tutorial series, I wanted to let you know that in the rest of the tutorial series, I'm going to be using the right mouse button to select objects. So I am a right-click selector. So if you haven't heard about this thing in Blender with left-click select and right-click select, basically before Blender version 2.8, right-click select was default. So you use the right mouse button to select objects, and I know that doesn't really make sense for other programs on the computer. Usually any program on a computer will use left-click to select. However, I started using Blender way back in 2016, and that was before Blender 2.8, and so I just learned Blender with right-click select. And so now I've built up muscle memory, and I'm really used to right-click select, and I like that better. So for the rest of the tutorial series, I'm going to use right-click select, so just keep that in mind if you're looking at my screencast keys. However, I'd recommend just learning Blender with left-click select, because most people now are going to use left-click select, and left-click select is turned on default. Now, if you want to change it for some reason, you can click here on edit, and you can go back to Blender's user preferences. And then you can click right over here on key map, and then you can see there's select with mouse button left and right. So I use right click select, but you could totally just keep it at left click. I'd recommend just leaving it at left click. And then there's just one more setting that I wanted to let you know about that I've changed, is I use the A key to toggle between selecting and deselecting. Now, on default in Blender, you use the A key to select all the objects, and then if you want to deselect all the objects, you have to double tap the A key. Now, that was again a feature, I believe it was added in Blender 2.8, and I really don't like that. I really don't like having to double tap the A key to deselect. It just really doesn't make sense for me. So what I've done is I've gone to edit, and I've gone to Blender's user preferences again, and then I've turned on this select all toggles button. And what this will do is it will change the A key to toggling between selecting and deselecting. And if you like that better, then you could also turn that on so you could select all toggles, and then you could click on that save preferences button, which will save Blender's user preferences so that in all of your future projects, the select all toggles will be enabled. So with that on, the A key will toggle between selecting and deselecting. I like it much better than double tapping the A key to deselect, so you can really just do whatever you want. So I just want to make you aware of that so that you're not confused if you're trying to follow along with my screencast keys. Alright, so in this part, we are going to be modeling the hat on the top of the snowman. So let's press Shift A for the add menu. I can go down here to mesh, and the closest thing to a top hat is going to be a cylinder. So let's add a cylinder. And the cylinder is pretty big, so I will zoom out. So let's hit the S key to scale the cylinder way down, and then I can hit the period on the numpad to zoom into it. And then I can hit G to grab, and we'll hit Z and just bring that up on the Z axis, and we'll just place that there on top of his head, and I'll scale it down a little bit more. So now that this is about the size of the object, I'll just press Ctrl A because I want to apply the scale, so this is now the object's new default size. We talked about this in the previous part. If I press the N key to open the side panel, each object has a default location rotation scale. So if I press Ctrl A and apply the scale, now you can see that the scale value is 1. So I'll press the N key to close that side panel. All right, now I want to have the hat kind of getting smaller as it goes down. So I'll hit the Tab key to go into edit mode. And I'm now going to introduce you to the different viewport modes. So far in this tutorial series, we have just been using the solid view, which is this here. So it's that button. Now there are 4 different viewport modes. So the first one is wireframe. So if you click here to go to wireframe, it will show you the wireframes of your object. So it will show you the geometry as these lines here. And then if you click here, this will go to solid view. Now solid view has a few different settings, and if you click on this arrow here, it will give you options for the viewport mode that you're on. So right now we're on solid mode, and so there's basically this thing called a matte cap, and the matte cap is going to show you the shape of the object. It's basically like some real-time lighting. And so you can see that like right over here there's kind of a shadow, and then right over here there's a highlight. So if you click on the arrow here, you can click on these different lighting options. You can click on matte cap or flat or studio, and you can actually choose between these different matte caps. And you can see right here, if I click on matte cap, I've actually added in my own matte caps, and I actually have an older tutorial showing you how you can actually create your own matte caps and add in your own matte caps. If you'd like to watch that video, the link will be in the description, but really that's more of an advanced thing. You can just use the default matte caps in Blender, and you can really choose whichever one you like. I'm going to leave it at the default one for this tutorial series. So I'm going to choose this one, but basically the matte cap is just kind of going to visually show you the solid shape of your mesh. And then the wireframe here, we talked about that. That's going to actually show you the wireframe, so it'll show you the vertices and the edges. Now these two here, these we're going to use later in the tutorial series for the lighting and materials, but this one here is the material preview. So this is going to create a preview of your material, and it's going to add some basic lighting. So if you click here on the shading, you can see there are going to be these HDRIs, and again, we will talk about this later in the tutorial series, but these are going to be some world lighting, and so you can change this and it will change how the lighting is going to look. You can also like make the lighting stronger or less strong. Now this is just a material preview, so this material preview mode is not actually going to show up in the render. So this is not how it will look up in the render. This is basically just a mode that you can use to preview the materials and see how they're going to look. And we'll be using these later in the tutorial series when we do the lighting and materials. And then the last one here is the rendered mode. So if you choose rendered mode, it's going to show you a preview of what your scene will look like if it were to actually be rendered. And because we haven't added any lights in the scene, it's very gray. You can't really see any of the lighting in the materials because we haven't added any lights. So we'll be going over these later in the tutorial series, but just know that there are 4 viewport modes. The wireframe is good for like editing the mesh. The solid view is just good most of the time. You're going to use solid view. Then the material preview can be used to preview the materials, and then rendered mode is to actually see how your scene will look like when it's rendered. So we're going to go to the wireframe, and what's great about the wireframe is it will go through the mesh. So it'll basically show you kind of like an X-ray behind the mesh. Whereas if I'm in the solid view, I can't see behind the mesh, but if I'm in wireframe, I can actually see those vertices behind the mesh. Now why this is helpful is because I want to select all of the bottom parts of the cylinder. Now if I am in the solid view, if I click and drag to add a box and just try to select the bottom part of the cylinder, you can see I'm only selecting half of it because I can only see half of it. Well, if I go into wireframe mode, I can now click and drag, and it's going to box select all of the bottom part of the cylinder, and I can actually see the bottom part of the cylinder. So I'll click here to go back to the viewport mode. Now there's also a shortcut which I'd recommend memorizing because it's really going to speed up your workflow, and that is to hold down the Z button. So when you hold down the Z button, this menu is going to come up, and this is called a pie menu, and it's going to come up around where your mouse is. So you can hold down the Z button, and then you can choose between the rendered view, the solid view, the material preview, or the wireframe. So you hold down the Z button, then you move your mouse to one of these buttons here, and then you let go of the Z button. So you can see very quickly, just by holding down the Z button, I can quickly switch between the different modes. And you know, right now when you're first learning Blender, you're going to have to read each one, but because I've been using Blender for so long, I don't even have to think about which mode I'm going into. I just know that, you know, right is going to be solid and left is going to be wireframe, and all the different modes. All right, so now that I've selected the bottom of the cylinder, I want to scale it down a bit. So I'll just hit S to scale. We can make the whole thing a bit smaller. I can also hit G to grab and maybe bring the whole thing up on the Z axis a bit. So now it kind of tapers in as it goes down. So now what I want to do is add the brim of the top hat. So let's hit the E key to extrude. Then right after that, instead of extruding it, I can hit S to scale. So we're going to extrude out what we've scaled. And let's just bring that out kind of about that far and click there to place that. Then I can hit E to extrude, and this time we're going to hit Z to make sure it's going down on the Z axis, and we're just going to make it kind of about that thick. So place that there. And there you go. You can see we already have a basic top hat. Now, if you want to resize how big the brim is, there is another way to select the loops of vertices. And that is to hold down the Alt key and then just select the loop. And so for most of you out there that are using left click select, just hold down the Alt key and then left click to select the loops of vertices. And you can see whichever edge you select, it'll select the loop which is going along with that edge. So you can hold down the Alt key, select that loop, and then if you want to select multiple loops, you can hold down the Shift and Alt key at the same time and select that loop. And why you're holding down the Shift key is because the Shift key will allow you to select multiple things. So now that we've selected the bottom of the top hat, we can scale the whole thing down. Now the problem with this is that as we scale it down, it's also getting smaller on the Z-axis. But I don't want it to be smaller on the Z-axis because I want it to have the same thickness. So I'll hit S to scale, and then we can actually exclude the Z-axis. So to do that, we're going to type Shift-Z. So hit Shift-Z. Now it'll scale it on the X and the Y, but not the Z. So I can make that smaller or bigger, and then just place it there. So now that's a bit smaller. I think that is a bit of a better size. So the next thing that I want to create is kind of like this ring, which is going to be around the top hat, kind of like a ribbon. So to do this, I can hold down the Alt key, and then you can select that loop there, and it's going to select the ring of vertices, or that loop. And then we can duplicate this, and the shortcut key to duplicate is Shift-D. So we can duplicate that, and then right after we duplicate it, we can immediately hit the S key. So now we're scaling out what we duplicated. So I'm going to make it just a little bit bigger and place it there. And then I want to bring it back down. So I'll hit G to grab, and I'll hit Z to bring it on the Z axis, and I'm going to bring it inside there. So now if I zoom in here, you can see it's going to be inside the top hat. So I can now hit E to extrude, and then I want to extrude it on the Z axis. So I'll hit Z, and we can bring that up, and then just place it there. And then I want it to move up with the taper, so I'll hit S to scale. We're going to make that a little bit bigger, maybe even bring it down a little bit so it's not that big. And then to give it kind of some thickness so it goes into the top hat, I can hit E to extrude. And then again, immediately after that, you can hit S to scale what you've extruded and just bring that down in there. So I can hit Tab to go back to object mode, and we have a nice little top hat. Now you can see that the edges here are kind of rough, so I want to make this smooth. So I will use the object context menu, and because I use right click select, I use the W key, but you're of course just going to right click to bring up the object context menu, and then you're going to choose shade smooth. Now you can see there's a problem with this, and we did talk about this earlier in the tutorial series, but if there isn't enough geometry on the edges, and if the geometry is very sharp, if there's a sharp edge like this 90-degree edge, then the shade smooth really isn't going to look that nice. It looks kind of weird. You can see there's kind of like this weird dark area, and it just doesn't look right. So this is where I'm going to show you how to use the auto smooth. So if you bring up the object context menu, you can choose the shade auto smooth. And so what this will do is it'll smooth the faces which don't have a very big angle in between them. So it's going to smooth this part smooth, but then this angle here, this is a really big angle. It's about 90-degree angle. And so it's going to shade that flat. So this is smooth here, and going around the top hat it is smooth, but then this edge here is going to be flat. So that is where you can use the shade auto smooth. Now, if you want to control the angle of what it's going to shade it smooth, then again, just choose shade auto smooth. And then right after you do that, you can click right above my head here on the shade smooth setting. And you can see that there is an angle here. So if the angle is turned to 0, it's not going to smooth anything because it's going to use 0 angle. But as I turn the angle up, the more of an angle is in between those faces, it's going to smooth it. So if I turn the angle way up, bigger than like 90 degrees, it's going to smooth everything. So you can see we're having that weird issue again. So for most things, you're probably just going to use like a 30. I believe 30 is a good angle limit for the shade auto smooth. Now in this case, for this top hat, I'm not actually going to use the shade auto smooth. And that is because I actually want to smooth out these edges, because this edge is really, really sharp, but in the final render, I want it to be a little bit smooth on the edges so it doesn't look quite so sharp. And I also want there to be kind of like a little highlight in the reflections. So we're going to be adding the bevel modifier, which we added in the previous part. So let's go over here to the modifier properties. We can click on add modifier, and we can click on the search. And because we already used it, here it is, bevel modifier, so you can type in bevel or just click on the bevel, and now it's going to smooth those edges. So I can turn these segments up. Let's maybe just turn it up to like a 4 or a 3, and then I can also hold down the shift key and click and drag on this amount value here to make it much smaller. So I just want it to be pretty small, something like that. And then we're going to use the object context menu again, and this time we'll just choose shade smooth. So we're going to shade everything smooth. And now you can see the edges of the top hat are much smoother. And then also I'm going to press the 3 on the numpad to go to side view. If you don't have the numpad, you can use that emulate numpad feature that I mentioned earlier in the series, or you can also hold down the Alt key and you can click and drag with your middle mouse wheel. So Alt, middle click, and you can drag over to go to side view. So I'm going to go to side view here, and then I can select the top hat, and I think I want to scale the entire thing up just a little bit. And then I can also hit R to rotate, and we're going to rotate the top hat back a little bit so that, his face is going to be here. So we'll rotate it back a little bit, just like that. We can also press 1 on the numpad to go to front view, and I can rotate the top hat over a bit and hit G to grab and move it over a little bit so it's kind of cockeyed. All right, and then remember to press Control S as you're working on your project to save it. I like to save my project every couple of minutes just in case Blender crashes or something, so just press Control S to save your project. So we're now going to be creating the arms of the snowman. So we're going to create some little stick shapes and have them coming out of the snowman. So what I'm going to do is just add vertices and edges, and we're going to make the stick shapes, and then we're going to be using a modifier to make the edges thicker. So let's go to the add menu with Shift A. We can go here and add a plane, and then I want to merge all of the plane together so that it is just one vertex in the center. So I'll hit the tab key to go into edit mode. We can make sure that everything is selected in edit mode, and we can hit the M key. So in edit mode, the M key is going to be used to merge all of the selection. So we want to merge at center. So this way, if I zoom in here, there's going to be one little vertex there in the center, and then I can hit the E key, and that will extrude an edge out of that vertex. So now I'm just going to hit E to extrude, and I'm just going to make a very basic shape for the arm of the snowman. So extrude that out there, select this, extrude that out there. And that's pretty much it, just a basic arm for the snowman. Let's scale this down. Let's bring it down. We can also press Control A and apply the scale. So that's the default size. I think I actually want to scale it up a little bit. Maybe like that is a bit better because it was a little bit small. Maybe even bring that down a bit. And then we can again press Control A and apply the scale. All right, so now this actually won't show up in the rendered mode because faces are the only part of the mesh which will show up. So by themselves, vertices and edges are not going to show up in the rendered view. So you need to have some faces. So we want to make this thicker. So we can use a modifier for this. So we're going to go to the modifiers panel. Let's click on add modifier, and we can just start to search for skin. So let's choose the skin modifier, and it's kind of hard to see what it's doing right now, but it's basically going to make everything thick. So let's hit the tab key to go into edit mode, and you can't really see it. So I will hold down the Z button and move my mouse over to the wireframe view and then let go. So now we're in wireframe, and I can press the A key to make sure everything is selected. So we want to make it smaller because right now it's way too thick. So to make it smaller, you can press Control A. Press Control A, and then you can drag your mouse, and we're going to make it much smaller. So now I'll hold down the Z button and move my mouse back over to the solid view with that pie menu, and I'll press Control A again, so you can see what the skin modifier is doing is basically adding some thickness. So now it looks like the sticks of the snowman's arm. So that is pretty good. So I'll go back to object mode. Now you can see that it's all kind of like a square shape, and that's not really what I want. I want it to be more smooth. So I'm going to be adding a subdivision surface modifier to make it smoother. So we'll click on add modifier. We can click here on the search, and here it is. We already added it, so it's here on the top, subdivision surface, and now it's smoothing it out. And I'm going to turn the render to 3, so it will render with 3 subdivisions, but then the viewport, I'm just going to leave that at 2. So 2 on the viewport and 3 on the render. And then again, if you need to, you can go into edit mode by pressing the tab key. You can then press Control A, and you can make it a bit bigger if you want it to be thicker, and then you can also move these around to change the size of it. And then if you go back to object mode, again using the object context menu, you can click on shade smooth, but you can see it actually won't do anything. That's because on the skin modifier, you need to click on smooth shading, so now it is actually shaded smooth. All right, so that is looking really great for the snowman's arm. Now there is something else that I want to do to the arm, and that is that I want to make it look a little bit bumpy and lumpy, kind of like what we did for the snowman body, or the snowballs. And that is because this is going to be a stick, so there's going to be like bark, and so the bark should be kind of bumpy, so I want the stick to be more rough. So let's click on add modifier, we can go to the search, and we can go here to displace, we'll add the displace modifier, and then again, we want to do the same exact thing as before, so we'll click on new here to add a new texture. Let's click on this button here, or we can click right over here to go to the texturing panel. And then again, we want to choose a noise texture to make it look kind of random. So on image or movie, we're going to change this to clouds. And then I can just change the size of this. So I want to make it much smaller. So we're going to make it much smaller, something like that. And then if we click back over here to go to the modifiers, you can see it's way too strong. So it's kind of distorted. So if we scroll down here, we want to go way down here to the corner to the strength. And I'm going to hold down the shift key and drag the strength value. And we're going to make it very, very small. So just a very small number. And then I'm going to go with a 0.02. Actually, that's even a bit too small. So just a 0.01. So now you can see it's a little bit bumpy there. And if I turn the levels viewport up to 3, you can see how it'll actually look. So it'll be a bit more detailed, but to make sure it's not too laggy, I'll turn the levels viewport just to 2. And then I actually want to real quick go back over to the texturing properties, and I want to turn the scale on even more. So let's make the scale even smaller. So just something like that is pretty good. All right, so I now want to select this object here, and I want to duplicate it to the other side. So in object mode, you can press Shift D to duplicate. Let's bring this over here. And then this is a great spot for the trackball rotation. So if you double tap the R key, it's going to use the trackball rotation, and you can just rotate that over here. Now, something that you might notice here is that the object isn't rotating by its center. It's rotating by this little dot here. And this little orange dot is called the origin point. So every object has an origin point, and generally the origin point is going to be in the center. However, if you go into edit mode and then move the mesh, the origin point won't be moving because you're not actually moving the object, you're just moving the mesh which is in the object. But if you're in object mode and then move the mesh, the origin will move with it. So wherever the origin point is, that is where the object is going to be scaled or rotated or moved. And so generally you're going to want to have the origin point in the center there, so that it scales it from the center. So that's just something to note for future use. So I can hit G to grab, let's move this over here, and I can stick it inside there. So G to grab, stick that there. And then we can make this one look a little bit different. So for this one, I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to select this vertex here, and I'll hit X, and let's click on delete. We're going to delete the vertices, and then I can make this one a bit longer. You can also click and drag to box select some of the parts and just kind of rotate it so it's different. And then you can select this vertex here. You can hit E to extrude and make that longer. Then you can also select this one here and hit E to extrude and bring that out, just to kind of make it look a bit more random, because I want to make it look like it's a stick, like from a branch, like a tree branch, and then hit tab to go back to object mode. But that is going to be it for the modeling of the stick hands. All right, so I'm now going to be modeling those little pieces of coal, which are going to be for his eyes and his mouth. So let's go to the add menu with Shift A, and for this, I'm going to add another icosphere. Now, because this one is going to be very small, I don't need very much detail. So if I click here on the add icosphere settings, I just want to make sure this is at 2. And then I can close those settings. So I can now scale this way down, and I can also move it over here, and I want to stick it where the eye is and scale it down, G to grab, move that over there. And then again, we can use the object context menu to shade that object smooth. Now, because this object is going to have very similar modifiers to this object, we can actually tell it to copy the modifiers. So what we can do is we can select this object first, and then we can hold down the shift key and select this object last. And so because this object is last, it is considered what's called the active object. So if you select multiple objects by holding down the shift key, the last object that you select is going to have this more yellow outline, where the other objects are going to have the orange outline. And so the yellow outline object, that is the one you selected last, and that's the active object. So just select this object, shift, select this object, and then to copy the modifiers from one object to another, you can press Control L. Control L will bring up this link and transfer data, and we can just click on copy modifiers. So now if I select this object, you can see it has the same modifiers, and you can turn up the viewport levels just to kind of see what it's doing. Now what I want to do is actually change the displace texture, because the texture is kind of too big. So I'm going to click on this button here, which will go over to the texturing properties. and right now it is using the same texture. So if I were to scale this, you can see it's scaling the texture for both of them at once, but I want this one to be a different one. So to do this, we are going to duplicate the texture so that it is separate. So I'm going to click on this little button here on the texture. So you can see if this drop down here, if you click on the drop down, it's going to show you all the textures in your Blender file. So I'm going to click on this button here to duplicate it, and now you can see it's called texture 002. If I click on this to rename it, I can rename it to texture coal, because this is going to be like the coal eyes. So now if I change the scale of it, you can see it's not going to affect the other object. Now this object here really just doesn't have enough detail, and I also need to apply the scale. So we're going to press Ctrl A and apply the scale, so that's the new scale of the object. Now you can see if I change the scale, it is kind of affecting it a little bit. So I'm going to make the size very small, like a 0.01. And then if I go over here to the modifiers, I want to add a bit more detail. So what I'm actually going to do is click here on these little dots on the subdivision surface, and I'm going to drag it up. So this way it's going to subdivide it first before adding the displace texture. So now it has a bit more detail. And then if I click right back here, this is going to go back to the texturing tab. I can change the scale. So I'm going to turn that scale up a little bit to maybe like a 0.03. That is a little bit better. Actually, I'll just go with like a 0.02. And then it's a bit too strong right now. So if we click back here on the modifiers, we want to turn the strength down. So I'll turn it to like a 0.01, and that is a bit better. So now you can see that it's kind of lumpy and it looks like a piece of coal for his coal eyes. So now we can press Shift D to duplicate this eye and have another one. Let's double tap the R key. That will do the trackball rotation. We can kind of make it random just so the eye looks a little bit different. And there we go. Our snowman now has some eyes. So now we can make the mouth. So I'm going to select this object here. Again, press Shift D to duplicate it and drop it over here. And I want to introduce you to another really cool tool, which is the snapping tool. So I could manually kind of place these and place them in the snowman's face, but instead I can actually tell the object to be snapped to the surface of another object. So to do this, you're going to click on this button right here, and it looks like a magnet, and that is the snapping feature. Now the shortcut key is Shift Tab. So if you want to toggle on and off the snapping, it's Shift Tab or just click right here. I don't use it very often, so I usually just click on the button. So now if I hit G to grab, you can see that it's going to be snapping by increment. So if you zoom way out here, you can see it's going to be snapping by like the Blender grids. If you press the 1 on the numpad to go to front view and then move it, you can see it's going to be snapped by increments. So instead of it being snapped by increments, I'm going to click on this little drop down here, and we can actually change the settings. So I'm going to change it to face instead of increment. Now if I hit G to grab, you can see it's following the face. So you can see if I like move it over here or move it over here, it's actually going to snap onto the surface. So I can scale this down and then double tap the R key and hit G to grab, and I can just kind of snap it right here. And then you can see that sometimes it's going inside the snowman. So I'm going to click back here on the settings, and you can choose snap with. I'm going to click on center. So this way it'll snap to the very center of that object. So now you can see kind of there, it's popping out like halfway because it's snapping to the center. So I can now press Shift D to duplicate and just drop it there. Double tap the R key, give it a random rotation. Shift D to duplicate, drop it there. Double tap the R key, give it a random rotation. Shift D to duplicate, random rotation. And one more, and then double tap the R key to give it a random rotation. So now I can kind of just place these where I want, and you can see very quickly we were able to create the snowman's mouth. So now to turn off the snapping feature, you can press Shift Tab or just click on that button. All right, and there we go. So there is the mouth and the eyes. So we're now going to be modeling the carrot nose. So I will go to the Add menu. Let's go to Mesh, and a cylinder is close to a carrot shape, so we're going to add a cylinder. Now, this cylinder on default has a lot of geometry. You can see how many faces there are. So right above me, you can click on that little add cylinder setting there to open it up. And here on the vertices, I can just make these much smaller. So I'll just make it like a 12. 12 is a better size. So you can see now it's kind of a bit more low poly because we don't need that many faces. So I can close the add cylinder settings by clicking there. So it's way too big, of course, so I can hit S to scale, make it really small. We're going to zoom in here. You can also press the period on the numpad to zoom into it, make it much smaller and bring it over here. And then you can hit R to rotate. And we want to rotate it on the x-axis, so hit X. And then I want to rotate it exactly by 90. So you can type in 9, 0, and enter. Hit G to grab, move that over, and just stick that right there. And let's actually bring it a little bit forward, and then I can hit Tab to go into edit mode. So then you can click the 3 on the top of your keyboard, or click here to go to the face select, and we'll select this face. and I can hit E to extrude, so extrude that out, and then S to scale. And I want to make this really small because I want it to be like the round top of the carrot, so just like that. Then I can select this face here, and this is where going to side view, the orthographic side view, can be really helpful. So if you hit 3 on the numpad, now it's going to go to the flat orthographic side view, and I can hit G to grab, and I think I'll move this down a bit so that it's kind of rotated, and I can scale it down a little bit with the S key, and then E to extrude, bring that out, G to grab and bring that up a bit, and then S to scale that down, and we're going to make it much more thin, and then E to extrude and S to scale, and also R to rotate so that the carrot is a bit random. All right, that was pretty good. So let's hit Tab to go back to object mode, and then also you can use the object context menu and shade the object smooth. So again, just right click and then click on shade smooth. All right, we can maybe scale this down a little bit more and bring it in. And also, I don't remember if I did this yet, but let's press Control A and apply the scale. So that's now the new default size. Now I think that nose is a little bit too long. So we can select this part and we can bring it back in. So we'll hit Tab to go to edit mode. We can hold down the Z button. That'll bring up the menus here for the mode. We'll choose the wireframe preview, and then I can click and drag and just box select those faces, or if you're in the vertex select, you can click and drag to box select the vertices. Then you can hit G to grab, you can bring it back in, and actually this might be better to do on the side view, the orthographic side view. So hit 3 on the numpad for side view, so it's flat, G to grab and bring it back a little bit, maybe rotate that a little bit like that. All right, hit Tab to go back to object mode, and then hold down the Z button and move your mouse over to solid view and let go. Now I want to make this more smooth because you can see, again, that subdivision surface modifier doesn't look that good, and you can see it's kind of sharp on the edges. So there's actually a shortcut key because the subdivision surface modifier is so common. So what you're going to do is press Control and then press the top number keys on the top of your keyboard. So if you want to add a subdivision surface with 2 levels, you can press Control 2. Control 2, and now you can see already the carrot looks much more smooth, and you can see here's the level, viewport, and render. I'm going to turn the viewport levels to 1, but then have it render at 2. And then you can hit the R key to rotate it, and you can just kind of stick it in here. And I want to actually double tap the R key and kind of have it coming off to the side a little bit, so it looks a bit more random and kind of quirky. So just kind of have the snowman's nose coming off to the side a little bit. All right, don't forget to press Control S as you're saving the project. So that'll wrap it up for this part. So I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching. And if you're enjoying this tutorial series and you'd like to help support the channel, then some great ways to do that are by checking out my Gumroad store, where I have lots of Blender products, or you can also check out my Patreon page, and you can join a membership on my Patreon page to support the channel monthly and also get access to lots of Blender content on my Patreon page. Those are some great ways to help support this channel. So in the next part, we are going to be modeling the buttons on the snowman, and we're also going to be modeling some little threads going around the buttons. So it'll be a little bit more advanced modeling. So when the next part is released, you can find it right up there on the end screen, and it will also be in the video description. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next part.